I'm really, really passionate about stories and storytelling and connecting people with stories. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So I'm going to tell a story today that's from Yugoslavia, and it's a story that has a lot of spinning in it. And I'm a spinner, not cyclocross spinning, spinning on a spinning wheel and turning things into wool or yarn. And I think that was one of the first things that grabbed me about the story is that it's so domestic. But I'm assuming no one else here spins. So there's just a couple of things I wanted to show you about some terminology that's going to come up. So in the story, they talk about a distaff, which is basically a long stick that you wrap your roving that you spin from. So this is sheep roving that I've combed, and you pull it out as you spin. And if you're spinning outside and the wind's blowing, all this blows into your spindle and makes a horrendous mess. So a distaff is basically just a stick that you tie the stuff onto so your spinning doesn't get stuffed up. At one point, some yarn is going to be reeled, and that means you're basically just turning it from your spindle into a big oblong shape like that, so that when you dye it, you don't end up with a kilometer of tangled yarn in your pot. It all stays nicely contained. And then this story is not a spinning wheel story like last week we had a spinning wheel. This one uses something called a spindle, which is a very old way of turning fleece or flax into thread. And I just wanted to show you how it works. So you spin the stick and then you very carefully feed the fleece in it. Ooh. And then I can do about 20 centimeters, and then you open it up, wind it back on, and prepare it. And then you spin and draft into the spindle. But every time you do about this much, you've got to stop and wind it back on. So it takes me about 7 minutes to spin a meter using my drop spindle. And for me to make a jumper takes 2,000 meters. So that's why people didn't have cupboards full of outfits back then, because it was a very slow process. All right, so after my TED talk about spinning and everything you need to spin, I just wanted to bring us all into the space. So I want you to close your eyes if that's what you're into, and just imagine a wooded place that you really love. It can be somewhere in the bush. It can be a park near your house. It could be somewhere you went as a child. It could be a forest from a book that you love. And I just want you to imagine sitting in that forest and watching time go past. So first hearing the birds, and then seeing the slight change of color as the sun gets ready to rise, the morning star appears, the sun comes up from the red to the golden light, and as the sun rises, the busyness of the forest starts. All the little things moving around. Maybe there's other people in your forest with you. And we go through the cycle of the day, the insects buzzing around at noontime. And then as the light changes back into the blue, as we go towards the setting sun, where everything gets really quiet. And just drink in that piece of the forest. And when your heart's full of the forest, take a deep breath, open your eyes, and we'll walk into a story together. The Wood Maiden, a story from Yugoslavia. At the edge of the village, much closer to the forest than the main square of the village, there lives a girl. Batushka is her name, and she lives in a small tumble-down cottage with her mother. And they have 3 nanny goats. And Batushka's job, day in, day out, year after year, is to walk into the forest with her goats and pasture them. As she walks out of the house, her mother hands her a small basket with 2 slices of bread, a spindle, and some flax, and it's Batushka's job to make sure that spindle is filled every day. And her mother would always stand at the door and say, now you see that you bring back home a full spindle. Now, Batushka and her mother were so poor that she couldn't afford a distaff. So as she walks out the door, she would take her roving for the day and she would tie it around her head like a little crown. And she would walk into the forest, into the trees with the goats. Now, one thing to know about Batushka is that she was very cheerful. She was always singing and dancing. So she'd walk on a normal day into the forest. She'd find some good green grass for the goats. And she would get out her spindle and she would start spinning. And as she spins, she'd spin, she'd sing. And at lunchtime, she would pack her spindle away. She'd call the goats to her, give them each a mouthful of bread, and then she would walk into the forest to find some lunch. And she would forage for some strawberries or some mushrooms, nuts if it was the end of autumn. And after she'd collected her food, she'd go back to her goats. She'd sit down, enjoy her lunch. And then for the sheer joy of it, she would stand up and she would start singing and dancing. And that's how she would spend the noonday hour. When her feet were tired, she'd sit back down, she'd get her spindle out, and she'd start spinning and spinning and spinning. As the sun started sinking low, she would call the goats to her, and she would go back to her mother's cottage, skipping and dancing as she went. One day, the day started as per normal. Batushka called the goats to her. She had her flax roving around her head like a crown, and she was skipping and dancing down the path into a new part of the forest, for the grass was a bit longer there. And she sat down and she started spinning and spinning and spinning. And when the sun was right at the top, she put her spinning down. She gave some bread to the goats so they wouldn't stray, and she walked into the forest. And what was this? Wild raspberries, like red jewels in the leaves hidden away. And she picked a basketful and she went back to the meadow and she sat down and she ate her fill. After her meal, Batushka stood up and she started twirling and twirling. And a voice came. Batushka, do you like to dance? Oh, yes, she cried out. And out from behind a birch tree stepped a tall, slender maiden. She was dressed in a fine white dress with a green girdle, yellow hair cascading down her back, and on her head she had a crown of wildflowers. Oh, I do love dancing, said Batushka. I could dance forever and ever, she said. Well, shall we? And the lady held out her hands and she took Batushka, and the two of them started twirling and singing and hopping and dancing and cavorting. It was the best dance ever. In fact, the dancing was so amazing that Batushka forgot about the goats and she forgot about her spinning. All of a sudden, the forest was quiet, the maiden had gone, and Batushka glanced over and she saw her half-filled spindle. Oh no, she cried. The spinning, the spinning. And she gathered everything, collected the goats, and she drove them down the path, quiet, wondering, how is she going to explain this to her mother? She knows her job is to fill that spindle, and this one is not even half full. The goats looked behind them every now and again as if to say, is this our happy Batushka walking home with us? What's going on? And Batushka's mother, waiting at the front door, saw her little girl come down the path, looking very serious. Batushka, she called out, are you okay? Oh, mother, I have a terrible headache and I sang too much. I have a horrible sore throat. Mother, I need to go to bed right now. And Batushka slunk into the cottage, and on her way, she hid the half-full spindle in the work basket. And she went to bed and she lay under the covers, thinking, how would she explain what happened today? Just before she finally fell asleep, she thought, I just have to go into the forest earlier than before and do twice as much spinning, and then I will make up for what happened yesterday." So before the sun was even up, Batushka leapt out of bed, gathered everything she needed, and she marched into the forest. Her mother was a little bit concerned because marching is not how Batushka moved. By the by, Batushka found a meadow, and she sat down and she took out her spindle, and she was spinning faster than she had ever spun before. But the sun was coming through the leaves, and there was a gentle breeze blowing, and the birds were singing, and before long Batushka was singing for the joy of the work and for the joy of the morning. When the sun had reached noon, she packed up her things, gave the goats some bread, walked into the forest. She didn't walk very far. She gathered the first thing she found, some old nuts and a couple of mushrooms. She wolfed down her food, and she got out her spindle, and she started spinning and spinning and spinning and winding and spinning and winding and spinning. And one of the nanny goats came over and nudged her in the shoulder. "Oh, my dear," she said, "I cannot stop to dance today. I must finish my spinning." And a voice came through the trees. "Did you not enjoy the dancing?" Batushka leapt to her feet, nervously standing between the trees. "Oh, yes," she said, I did enjoy the dancing, but I didn't get my spinning done. My mum will be furious when she finds out." "Oh, Batushka," said the lady, "we will find a way to get your spinning done. Come dance with me." And she took Batushka by the hand, and the two of them took off into the meadow, spinning and jumping and leaping and singing and exchanging steps. Batushka's feet didn't even feel tired. And the hours passed without Batushka realizing, and suddenly the forest went quiet, and she saw that half-empty spindle like an angry sign on the grass. And Batushka fell into a heap, and she started crying. The Wood Maiden was patting her on the shoulder, saying, "Batushka, what's wrong?" "Oh, lady," she said, the spinning, I have to spin my part." The Wood Maiden looked at her, and she said, "I can help with this." And she picked a branch from a birch tree as a distaff, and she took the roving from Batushka's head, and she started spinning and spinning and spinning. And before you could snap your fingers 3 times, the spindle was full. "Oh, thank you, lady," said Batushka. And the lady looked down at her and she said, "You carry this home to your mother, but as you walk, you need to say, 'Reel and grumble not, reel and grumble not.' Will you remember, Batushka?" "Oh, absolutely, lady." And she took down the path, skipping as she went, for she had a full spindle to show her mother today. As she turned around the bend, reaching to her house, she saw her mother standing on the front porch, waiting for that girl to come home. And before Batushka had even opened the front gate, her mother called down, "Batushka, what were you doing in the forest yesterday?" And she said, "Oh, mother, I told you I had a terrible headache. Mother, I know I didn't finish the spinning, but look, I'm more than made up for it today." And Batushka's mother took the full spindle, and she nodded her head, and they went inside. Well, Batushka was relieved. No scolding came her way tonight. But that night, she was laying in her bed, and she thought, "Sure, the spinning's done, but something feels strange about this. Who is this woman in the forest? And why have I not told my mother what's going on?" "Well," thought Batushka, "I don't even know her name. How can I explain about the dancing and the singing in the forest?" As she drifted off to sleep, she was determined the next day she would know the lady's name. Well, the next morning, it was a glorious autumn morning, and she leapt out of bed, and she gathered all her things, and she took off into the forest. She found some sweet grass for the goats, and she sat down and she started spinning, looking around, hoping, is there a lady on the way? When the sun reached its peak, she called the goats, gave them some bread, and she took off into the forest. Today, a beautiful patch of wild strawberries, and she picked them amongst the flowers, and she went back to the meadow, and she ate her food, and she leapt to her feet, and she started showing the goats all the dance steps that she had learned. And just for the joy and the sunlight and the gentle breeze and the flowers all around her, she screamed, "I could dance forever!" And the lady stepped out from behind a tree and she said, "Oh, Batushka, I love dancing too. Let's go." And she took her by the hand, and the two of them took off, dancing around the goats and between the goats and around the trees and over the rocks. And this time, Batushka couldn't help noticing that the lady danced so lightly on her feet that you couldn't see the grass bend beneath them. But the birds were singing and the sun was streaming, and they took off dancing and dancing and dancing. And eventually, the forest quieted down, and the lady stopped dancing. And Batushka saw the half-empty spindle, and she said, "Could you help me again with the spinning?" And the lady said, "Batushka, I will give you something worth more than spinning." "Hand me your basket," said the lady. And Batushka handed over her basket, and the lady walked into the forest, and a few moments later she came back, and the basket was covered with a fine cloth. And she said, "Batushka, take this home to your mother. But as you walk, you need to say, 'Look not inside until I get home. Look not inside until I get home.'" And she handed Batushka a half-full spindle, and the lady was gone, as if the ground had swallowed her up. Well, time was getting on, and Batushka collected the goats, and she took off down the track, singing, singing, singing. But as she walked, that half-empty spindle got heavier and heavier and heavier. And that basket sure felt like it had nothing inside her. Did the lady play a trick on her? Well, her footsteps slowed, and every now and again she would still say, "Look not inside until you get home." But what does that mean? Eventually, Batushka's footsteps stopped, and she stood there deliberating. And she thought, "I'll just lift a corner." And she lifted a corner of the cloth on the basket, and what was this? The basket was full of leaves. And Batushka grabbed a big handful and she threw them on the path. And she was about to tip the leaves out when she thought, "I might as well take a few home for the goats to eat tonight." Well, she put her spindle into the basket and she marched on home, ready to face whatever her mother will have for her. She rounded the corner to get home, and there her mother was waiting on the front porch. When her mother saw her, her mother took off running from the porch, flung open the gate. "Batushka, Batushka," she yelled. "Batushka, what's been going on?" "Oh, mother, I will tell you everything." "Batushka," she said, "what has been going on?" "I took that spindle of yours from yesterday and I started reeling it. And I reeled around and I completed one skein and a second one and a third one. And halfway through the fourth one, I said, 'What the devil is going on?' And the spindle was empty. Can you explain this?" And that's when the story came tumbling out about the Wood Maiden and the dancing and the crying and the dancing and the songs and the joy and the half-empty spindle. And eventually Batushka's words slowed and she looked up and her mother looked at her, white as a sheet. "Batushka," she said, "that was one of the Wood Maidens. Batushka, they dance in some parts of the forest at noon and at midnight. And my dear, if you had been a boy, she would have danced you to death. But sometimes the Wood Maidens take a shine to a little girl and give her presents." "Mother," said Batushka, "she gave me a basket full of leaves and told me to not look inside." And her mother said, "Show me." And Batushka pulled the cloth off, and in the bottom of the basket, there were 3 gold coins. "Oh, mother," said Batushka, "she told me not to look inside and I poured all the leaves out on the path." And Batushka took running up to where the leaves dropped, and she rounded a bend, and there was a big drift of yellow birch leaves. And she turned around and she walked back. Her mother gave her a hug and said, "We still have more wealth now than we've ever had before." And I'm happy to report that Batushka and her mum were careful with this wealth. They fixed up their cottage, they expanded their goats, they made a good life for themselves. But it is said that even as an old woman, Batushka on an autumn morning would walk into the forest carrying a basket and an empty spindle, hoping for dancing. And that is the story of the Wood Maiden. So I invite you to cast your mind back through the story and see where in the story you find yourself. Which voice of the story speaks to your heart?